Resuming debate, the honourable member for Calgary Rocky Ridge.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I'm going to share my time with the member from Abbotsford. Conservatives have been calling for changes to this Act for years. For nearly 8 years, this government has ignored the growing role of state-owned and state-controlled enterprises in Canada's economy. For nearly 8 years, this government has failed to take seriously the threat posed by the government of Beijing. For nearly 8 years, this government has sat back passively while Beijing has used ostensibly private corporations as proxies to project their government's power and influence in the Canadian economy. And after 8 years, this government has finally tabled legislation to strengthen the Investment Canada Act, which is a good thing, but something that should have been done years ago. To assess this government's credibility on the issue, it's important that we examine its track record on protecting Canadians from investment from authoritarian regimes in the Canadian economy. This is a government that in 2017 failed to conduct a national security review when Beijing-owned Hytera Communications bought Norsat. The then Minister, Navdeep Bains, and the Prime Minister falsely claimed that a review was done. They're obfuscating the mandatory 45-day waiting period for approval with an actual fulsome national security review as defined in the existing Act. Even Tom Mulcair, former leader of the NDP, criticized the government for rubber stamping the Hytera deal, and this takeover had serious consequences for Canada's credibility with our allies. Norsat was an American defense contractor, and Canada allowed this takeover without a proper security review. Such a review is an option for the government under the existing Investment Canada Act, and that option was not undertaken on the Hytera deal. And since then, Hytera has been banned from doing business in the United States and faces 21 espionage charges. This is a company that this government let into Canada without a national security review on the Norsat deal. The same company then received a contract to supply radio communications equipment and work for the RCMP. The same company had a contract with Canada Border Services Agency for X-ray equipment. The same company, or this is the same government, that also failed to stop Ong Bong from buying a chain of seniors' homes, as we heard earlier from the NDP. Ong Bong also bought other buildings that raised concerns both about the substandard care that subsequently occurred in the seniors' homes that they took over, but also concerns about corporate espionage in other buildings that were part of that deal. So this is a government that contracted with a company whose founder was connected at the very top echelons of the PRC to supply X-ray equipment to 170 of our embassies. So this is a government that took years and years and years to finally ban Huawei from being a supplier of infrastructure to Canada's 5G network despite the obvious national security concerns. This reluctance has compromised Canada's credibility with our Five Eyes intelligence partners. And this government's current industry minister recently approved the Neolithium takeover without a national security review. The opposition has spent years raising important questions about cracks and loopholes in existing laws while the government has claimed that there was no need to change the law until now and falsely claimed that they were using the tools available to them to help keep Canadians safe. They did this with such arrogance, Madam Speaker. They claimed that the opposition was simply playing politics whenever we raised a question about national security. But this is what they do, Madam Speaker. They dig in when they find themselves on the wrong side of an issue, then finally flip while ignoring their past intransigence. This sudden flip, like what we're seeing right now on C-34, on the need to address investment by autocratic state-owned enterprises, it's just like last week's flip on C-21, and when they attempted to ban hunting rifles and shotguns. Did they admit that the opposition was right all along? No. Did they thank the opposition for raising a point that they had made a mistake that needed to be fixed? Did they admit that they were misleading Canadians for months? Did they admit that they were falsely claiming that the opposition was lying about the consequences of their amendment? Did the Minister of Public Safety admit that he was wrong and that he had misled Canadians? Did he apologize for attacking the opposition's motives? No, of course not. That's not what they do, Madam Speaker. What they do is they attack the motives of those that criticize them, but when it becomes absolutely clear, like it is on this issue today of investment by autocratic state-owned enterprises, they might backpedal, but they don't take responsibility, they don't apologize, and they don't admit that they were wrong. The opposition is just doing its job when it raises questions about public policy concerns, when we identify mistakes that the government has made, when we identify shortcomings in existing laws or potential consequences of a new law or policies. The opposition has an ancient and sacred obligation to force the government to try to be better. I just wish that they would listen from time to time, especially when it comes to national security. Liberals and conservatives really probably are not very far apart from each other on the role of government when it comes to national security. I would really hope that we're not far apart. This isn't an ideological difference. We all care about our national security. And so with that in mind, Madam Speaker, I have some suggestions and points for Parliament to consider and hopefully for the government to also consider. This bill does give the minister significantly more power, but not necessarily a pathway to its best decisions. Shifting power from cabinet, from ordering council, to direct ministerial decision-making, which is partly what this bill does, may result in faster decision-making, Madam Speaker, but not necessarily better decisions. I'm concerned that the lack of a clear, strong definition of a state-owned enterprise may harm overall foreign investment in Canada without protecting Canadians from hostile foreign governments. The Canadian economy relies on direct foreign investment. The parliamentary secretary talked about that. We need foreign private capital from reciprocating open economies, Madam Speaker, and we have to be careful about what signals this bill sends to global capital markets. I'm disappointed that this bill doesn't simply allow the government to ban governments from autocratic and hostile regimes like Russia, Iran, North Korea, or the People's Republic of China through a simple list, which might be the easiest way to deal with the small number of countries seeking to exert their state's power and influence within the Canadian economy through state-owned enterprises. I'm concerned that this bill doesn't appear to capture transactions that involve the sale of assets like mines, farms, intellectual property, data, rather than its shares to a foreign state-owned enterprise by a Canadian company. I'm especially concerned that by maintaining the existing $400 million threshold for a mandatory government approval of a foreign takeover, that leaves the door wide open for the growing concern of Beijing-affiliated entities to continue buying up farms, buying fishing enterprises, buying wharves, buying airport cargo facilities, and buying enterprises with diverse ownership, but which in aggregate have the potential to distort markets for important commodities like food. If the buyer of a Canadian company is the government of China, the threshold for a national security review should be $0 and capture every transaction by that state's foreign enterprises that are owned by the state. So in short, Madam Speaker, I'm not sure how much time I've got left. Okay, 1 minute, thank you. I do agree that this bill is an attempt to address a serious and important policy concern, so I will support the motion that's before the House to send it to committee. My opposition colleagues and I are committed to working with other parliamentarians to make this bill better. No party has a monopoly on good ideas, so this is a great opportunity to show Canadians that parliamentarians can work together, that the result of Parliament's adversarial process is that the best ideas will prevail through debate. And as we debate this bill and study it at committee, we can cooperate, we can get past mistakes that have been made in the past, and get serious about protecting Canadians from property theft, from espionage, from intellectual property theft, from market distortions, and other harms that result when foreign governments that are hostile to Canada's way of life take advantage of our open society and our open economy. We're talking about transactions that are not fueled by the market, Madam Speaker, but by raw power of a state to exert its influence on the Canadian economy. So I will vote for this bill, but it's weak and it needs a lot of work.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Official Opposition, the Honourable Government Whip, sorry. Deputy Whip.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. My question to the member is, I think I need further clarification to some of the comments that were made later in his speech about there being a zero threshold. I think that may not be the most effective use of everyone's time if we are chasing every dollar investment that is made in Canada. And do you find, I wanted to ask the member if he finds whether that would be time well spent in our system.
The Honourable Member for Calgary Rocky Ridge.
I think I was quite careful and precise in what I said, but I will repeat it. I said that if the foreign buyer is a Chinese state-owned enterprise, the threshold should be zero. So the threshold for the dollar amount of a transaction by a Chinese state-owned enterprise should be zero.
Questions et commentaires. L'honorable.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Pierre Boucher, Les Patriotes Verchères. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I thought that was a very insightful speech from my Conservative colleague who highlighted that there were cases in the past where they investigated after the fact and saw that there was an obligation to have a review for national security, and the government doesn't seem to have done the work that they were required to do to analyze whether the investment was a good thing or not. So with a bill like C-34, which we have before us, which would give some more power, but in the end, if the obligation is the same, if the government doesn't do its job more than it does now, does he think there will be changes? And I find it interesting because he mentioned a case, but I had a case in my riding where there was an obligation to have a review, and after a request for access to information, we saw that there was no review. So how is it that the government is delinquent on its own obligations? Does that concern my colleague?
The Honourable Member of Calgary Rocky Ridge.
Well, that's an excellent question and point that I did touch on, but it bears repeating. The government failed to use the existing tools under this act in the past. So here we are debating the creation of new tools and stronger tools with a government that wouldn't use the tools that already existed. So its credibility on this issue is a problem, and we need to get really serious about this, not just through new laws, but also implementation of laws, both existing and new as contemplated in C-34.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Winnipeg Centre.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The Harper government increased the threshold above which foreign takeover of a Canadian firm is reviewed from $330 million to $1 billion. I'm wondering if the member stands by that decision, or if he supports reducing the current threshold to zero so that every prospective transaction by either state-owned or state-controlled enterprises triggers a review. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
And for Calgary Rocky Ridge.
Well, as I've said both in my speech and in my remarks to the government deputy whip, if the buyer is a state-owned enterprise of an autocratic regime like the People's Republic of China, I think the threshold should be zero. With respect to the preamble to her question regarding the increase to the threshold in general, I think that was made to be compliant with regulation under the WTO. But I wasn't a member of that government, but that's my understanding of why that decision was made back in, I don't know, quite a number of years ago.
There's enough time for a brief question. The Honourable Member for South Shore St. Margaret's.
There seems to be some confusion on the Liberal side about this issue of zero state-owned enterprises. I've had in the last quarter, four lobster buying businesses acquired in my riding from a Chinese state-owned enterprise. They control the price at the dock. They pay 5 times the value of the business. They're taking over that. And that's why, from my view, I support what the member said. But I wonder if the member could expand on that a little more to educate the folks on the government side so they will accept some amendments.
The Honourable Member for Calgary Rocky Ridge, a brief answer.
Thank you. That's what this is all about, debate to get the best ideas out there. And this is why it is important to go to a $0 threshold when you're talking about a state-owned enterprise from the People's Republic of China. They buy a series of small businesses that in aggregate can actually distort markets. So buying a single fishing boat or buying a single wharf isn't perhaps going to distort the market, but when there are a whole series of transactions that are below a threshold but combined will have the effect of a much larger transaction.
Yeah.